Okay. It's a huge delight to welcome you this afternoon to hear my fantastic colleague, Professor Scott Hale, who's Senior Research Fellow, Associate Professor, and also a Fellow at the Turing Institute, which is an increasingly rare position. I've discovered I haven't given many of those out recently. Scott's been with us for quite a while. He did his DPhil here, finished in 2015, but he's developed a really fantastic body of work, really applying his computer science techniques, his computer science knowledge to really important research questions in the social sciences. So the work, like the topic we're going to hear about today, is really focused on this question of how you ensure properly equitable access to information online, good quality information online, and in particular, focusing on these challenges around communities with different languages, role of bilingual internet users, and in this context, we're going to look at misinformation specifically against this backdrop. Plan is to have about, I think, 40 minutes or so, is that right? Roughly, presentation. So then plenty of time for discussion and some Q&A. For those of you who are joining us online, so I should be clear, we have some people participating on Zoom. If you can put your questions into the Q&A box, and then we will save those until the end, and we'll answer them at the end of the session. Everybody else, just so you know, although obviously we are recording, only Scott and I think possibly me, I don't know, to be in view. But just bear in mind, obviously, if you interject halfway through, maybe your voice recorded. Anything else I should add by way of housekeeping?
I think that's all.
No. Wonderful. Scott, over to you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Vicky, for the kind introduction. Yeah, thanks everyone for making it out. It's really nice to actually be presenting to a room of people, and to those online. Great to have you with us as well. As Vicky said, I'm an associate professor here at the Oxford Internet Institute, University of Oxford. I also have an affiliation with the Alan Turing Institute, our National Institute for Data Science and Machine Learning, and with Midan, a nonprofit technology organization in the US. And maybe just to get us a bit warmed up, we can do these things in person. Like, how many of you were not born in the UK, right? The UK is not your country of birth. Wow, right? Most of the world. Keep your hand up if you still regularly consume media or stay in touch with friends from outside of the UK. Yeah, exactly. I think it applies to so many of us these days. And the internet has opened this as a fabulous possibility to move locations, even change languages, and yet keep in touch with people overseas. And huge opportunity. The sort of stats on this have been increasing year on year. These aren't great stats because they don't really actually capture a lot of the people like we're looking here, where you're temporarily moving maybe for work or study. But in terms of long-term residents in the US, 21.5% on the latest US Census, households speak a language other than English at home. Something like 17% of English and Welsh population is foreign-born. And these have been increasing since I started looking at this. I actually started looking at this about 10 years ago. Vicky said I did my PhD, my DPhil work here, and that was in the context of language online. And I want to say people like those we were just talking about, where you're changed countries, maybe changed languages, yet you're regularly consuming content. These bilinguals are really key links for the spread of ideas and innovation across languages and across countries. This is a bit old, but this is from a paper looking at Twitter connections, and how the different languages that people were speaking on Twitter are all interconnected. But what it doesn't really show, and there wasn't a great visualization for this, but the bilinguals in this network sit at really critical junctions. If you start removing bilingual people from the Twitter network, it falls apart more quickly into smaller components, into more components, more parts, than if you remove a similar number of monolingual speakers. So super vital. This was what I did my DPhil work on. But as I've gone on, I've realized, of course, what the internet also enables is for misinformation to spread across languages and across countries. And so here's one false claim that circulated related to COVID and alkaline foods, quote unquote. But it wasn't just that one claim. This is a claim that we saw repeated hundreds of times across dozens of languages, from Brazil to India to Indonesia, the Philippines, right? All repeating this claim. And maybe, having an extra little change in your diet isn't going to have the biggest impact or negative effect, that this false information can have. But in some cases, the consequences of misinformation targeting immigrant or diaspora communities can be really serious. So in the United States, measles was eradicated in 2000, but 17 years later, in 2017, Minnesota had their largest outbreak of measles for over 30 years. And that outbreak wasn't equally distributed. It was heavily concentrated in the Somali American community in Minneapolis, the capital of Minnesota. 64 of the 79 cases were in that community. And the causes of that outbreak stretched back a number of years, probably back till about 2011 at least, where members of the Somali American community in Minneapolis were being targeted with anti-vaccine misinformation and really encouraged to opt out of childhood vaccines. And so 6+ years later, only then did the consequences of that really become evident. And unfortunately, this is just one example of something that is all too common, in which community leaders lack the tools to identify and counter misinformation. And mainstream institutions, whether they're public health or mainstream fact-checking, simply overlook, or even worse, stereotype diaspora communities. And these sorts of actions, of course, can undermine trust. They allow misinformation to spread sort of under the radar, and ultimately put lives and livelihoods at risk. And these are disproportionately affecting immigrant communities. And it's not just health. Politicians do this as well. So Min too penned an op-ed in the Washington Post a while back, in the beginning of this year, about the stolen election in the US and how that narrative was being particularly pushed among certain immigrant communities. And politicians target their messages sometimes. They pick things that they know will resonate with a particular cultural context or in a particular location in a way that maybe it doesn't with the rest of the community. And so I want to submit that there's a real challenge when we get to misinformation, it's particularly outside of English. And yet, if we look at where the efforts are going, right, where are regulators putting their attention, advertisers, platforms, and where are fact-checking organizations working? Well, this is an analysis that one of our MSc students, Dorian, last year completed as part of his MSc thesis. And he graphed out a large analysis of about 250,000 fact checks from the beginning of 2019 till mid 2022, and found, the lion's share of those, this is an exponential scale here, the lion's share are in English. There's a few other languages maybe that have some: Portuguese, Indonesian, Hindi, Spanish, Arabic, and then, a much longer tail. But so much of our effort is going into English. And you can see this in action as well. So Avaz, a pressure group, did a study where they were looking at over 100 pieces of misinformation in 6 different languages about COVID. All of the information they looked at had been checked by independent fact-checking organizations and found to be false or misleading. And when they looked for that content on Facebook, they found that about 71% of it in English was labeled. Well, only 29% was missing a sort of warning label about there being a fact check that's being misinformation. But when they looked at those exact same claims in other languages, the percentage was far less. So for Italian, 68% of the pieces of content lacked a warning label, 70% for Spanish. In a follow-up piece, they also looked at the timing. How quickly was Facebook able to put a label on things? In English, it took them around 24 days. For non-English languages, it took almost a week longer, about 30 days. And so I want to submit that diaspora communities are particularly underserved by the way that we're approaching misinformation prevention online at the moment. One group or set of groups that I'm working with are Asian American and Pacific Islander, or AAPI communities. And now, despite that singular label of AAPI, it's actually encompasses more than 25 million Americans, and members of this, this label don't share linguistic, cultural, ethnic, or religious identities. They come from over 50 nationalities, more than 100 languages, and have huge socioeconomic disparities. And so even saying I'm working with AAPI is a little bit broad, right? You can understand the sort of challenges of identifying, encountering misinformation in such a setting. And members of AAPI in particular, but many immigrant groups, of course, how do you stay in touch with your friends and family back home? Well, you stay on the same apps that they're using, right? And so if you're a Chinese American, you're using WeChat to stay in touch. Or if you're, Filipino American, you might be on Viber. Japanese American, probably using Line, right? And these are platforms that, by and large, are sort of not in maybe my general use case. Okay, mine is, because I have Japanese family that I keep in touch with, but generally not there. Fact-checking organizations aren't really interested in looking on those platforms. As one US fact checker put it to me in a conversation, well, I'd have to spend half my fact check explaining what that platform is to my audience. And even then, they probably wouldn't get the misinformation because they lack the cultural context. And I might be, spreading that misinformation, amplifying it, if you like, to more people than it otherwise would have reached. And so mainstream fact checking, really is looking, well, how do we serve the largest part of society? And unfortunately, often leaving diaspora communities behind. In that setting, several organizations recently have started up their own efforts to fight misinformation online. So in the US, within AAPI communities, Desi Facts, coming out of the Indian American Impact group, has started up to try to serve South Asian Americans, Piaoba for Chinese Americans, Tayo for Filipino Americans, and Viet Fact Check for Vietnamese Americans. But these are relatively new groups. They're very heavily reliant on volunteer effort. They're not in the they don't have necessarily the same capacity that many of our IFCN or international fact-checking network organizations that maybe are much larger. When you think of the UK landscape, you think of Full Fact, or the only independent fact-checking organization here in the UK, or you think of PolitiFact, factcheck.org in the US case, perhaps. So one of the projects that I want to introduce today is a project called Coinsights. And in response to this, it's about trying to build the algorithms, the know-how, and the data to help community leaders be able to identify, preempt, and respond to misinformation in minority and minoritized communities. And I'm lucky in that project to be joined by a number of academic collaborators in the US. This one sits particularly in the US, which is why that's a sort of US-dominated slide. But here also at the Oxford Internet Institute, with funding from the Alan Turing Institute, we're also digging into some academic questions around misinformation, particularly trying to understand how we can better discover, track, and respond to misinformation, particularly on encrypted platforms, because we lack the sort of signals that Facebook.com or TikTok might have in terms of being able to look across all the content. I shared that example of how one claim is spread across lots of different languages. We really want to understand, is that the norm that things go across languages? Actually, Dorian's work in the MSc last year suggested it's a pretty small subset. Lots of things are one language, one country, one cultural context, and they stop there. And so what is it that makes some claims just have that sort of popularity where they're going right across languages and countries, and how do they change as they go? The sort of mutation, it was very interesting in that alkaline foods claim. What constituted an alkaline food seemed to heavily depend on your cultural context. So basically pick your favorite foods in your culture, and that was probably going to be an alkaline food, no regard to chemistry, mind you. Many of them were not alkaline at all, and viruses don't have a pH level, to be clear. But and then thinking also about the role of empathy and how do we respond and create sort of effective interventions. And this work, I'm joined by two of our DPhil students who are working as research assistants, Amy Muntz and Calvin Chang, on this work. So I want to introduce one tool. This is maybe one quiver, and how do we start to research misinformation on end-to-end encrypted platforms. And with that technology nonprofit I mentioned, Midan, where I work as director of research alongside here, we've been working on this idea of tip lines, accounts on social media to which you can add your community organization or a fact-checking organization, and then you can send messages and receive responses for misinformation interventions. And so this might look something like this. Hello, I want to fact check. Okay, here's the thing. I got sent this stuff about alkaline foods. I'm going to forward that message in. And I really want to know, is it true? This is a made up example, but we definitely see things like this come through. And then what we want to do is automatically go and search the misinformation interventions, fact checks, explainers, news articles that could help answer that question from this particular organization. This is a demo because it's a demo account, but you could imagine this being, AFP or, Dizzy Facts or an organization like that, right? And in this case, we want to say, hey, thanks for inquiring. No, that's a false claim. You can click here, get more info. Here's maybe a nice graphic you might forward on, because anecdotally, what we've seen is lots of times people aren't asking for themselves. They actually may know that this is misinformation already, but you get sent that message from crazy Uncle Joe, and you're like, how do I reply to Joe, right? Like I have to figure this out. And so being able to turn to a trusted third party, have a resource that maybe helps have that conversation. And some of our AAPI community orgs are producing bilingual content. And so you have that, maybe that fact check in both Vietnamese and English, and that enables some intergenerational conversations as well, which are super exciting. Midan's been working on this sort of tip line idea for about 4 years now, and have started building up a really nice partner base right across the world. It started in India in 2019, and since then, has started to grow. Brazil is a huge WhatsApp user base. Something like 99% of smartphones in Brazil have WhatsApp on them there. And then this year, in particular, there was work around the Philippine presidential election, the Brazilian presidential elections, and in the US, Spanish language content in the lead up to the US midterms as well. So, of course, to make tip lines work, we ultimately need good algorithms to help out. You could do this matching, manually, but we want to get people a response as quickly as we can. We want to try to get that accurate response. And so this means that we need to be able to match claims together. That also helps us understand demand. Is this sort of a one-off request, or are there, a number of people asking a similar question? And if we can match to fact checks, of course, as well, then that helps us send those back. As we saw in this previous example, though, of course, you can ask the same claim in a number of different ways. And so part of my work has been thinking about how do we effectively match claims together and match them to the right misinformation resource. Of course, one way to do that, maybe the most basic way you would think to start, right, is just textual overlap, the sort of lexical similarity. Like, okay, they both have virus, they both have this 4 gram of consume more alkaline foods level. And if you just take the sort of 1 gram, words at a time, just word overlap, the number of words in common over the number of total unique words, actually not that similar. This would be from 0, no overlap at all, to 1, they share, all of the same words. The 4 grams certainly helps us. We could probably do more there, and actually we do more in that regard. But ultimately, at the end of the day, there's a limit to how much you can do with just looking at the words, a sort of syntactic similarity. When we read this, we see, oh, defeat, that's kind of like eliminate, and pH has something to do with acidity. There's some meaning overlap here as well. And so what we really want to be able to do is start looking at the meaning of claims as well. And so, particularly if we have things in different languages, there's not going to be any word overlap. But even in English, you can end up with claims that don't have any word overlap in them. And so, there's an example here of 2 claims that are pretty similar, but they don't have any words in common. And yet, gargle, drink, cure, prevent, tea, hot water, often, daily, right? There are clearly some meaning overlap. And so one of the things that I've been working on is trying to build better semantic text similarity algorithms. And I did this in particular first for Indian languages, with the help of a number of colleagues here. So from the University of Michigan, Ashkan Kazemi from Michigan, Kieran Garamella from Rutgers, Devin Gaffey at Medan, and me. We were inspired by a paper Reimers and Ivech had written on how to take a well-performing English model and then a bunch of translated text and turn that into a multilingual model. And the idea here is that when it comes to English, we have large data sets where we have pairs of sentences, sentence 1, sentence 2, how similar they are. And so we can train pretty high quality models in English. But as soon as we turn to other languages, we simply don't have that same volume of data to train a new model from scratch. Instead, though, what we can do is we can take that English model as a teacher, and we can train a new model. And we can say this new model, we want it to basically match the same answers as the English model when it comes to English sentences. And we also want it to match those English answers for anything that's a direct translation from the English. And of course, we actually have a lot of parallel text from translated books, translated user interfaces, right? And so we went off, there's a large collection called Opus. We took parallel data for 7 Indian languages and essentially pulled those representations of those languages into alignment with English, where we had a high-performing model on similarity. And that allows us to create, these vectors. And then once we have 2 vectors, we can ask, so what's the angle between them, right? If they're really dissimilar, or actually as the angle decreases, they're really similar to one another. And so we needed some data, however, to evaluate how well we were doing. And so for Bengali, English, Hindi, Malayalam, and Tamil, we took, and we actually did pay we paid annotators to label pairs of messages from WhatsApp, large groups, and from tip lines, as well as news headlines for how similar they were. And then we were able to use that data for evaluation, right? So to be clear, we didn't have enough data to use it for training, but it was just enough for us to evaluate those models. We built that data set, and then I had every researcher's nightmare. Google Research came out and they said, we have a new model that does text similarity across languages. It's called LaBase. and it's, language agnostic BERT sentence encoder. It's brilliant. It works in all those languages you were just trying to do. Oh no, well, let's look, let's see how well we do. And indeed, I'll show you two metrics. If you look at precision, when the model thought two things were correct or were a match, how often was that the case? And our model, the one in green, as well as the Google model that got released partway through our research, do really well on, when something matches, when they think it matches, it does. There was an older model that Meta had developed earlier called Laser. We knew about that from the beginning, but we also knew it was older and had some real limits. And so that it really, has a number of false positives. And it says something matches, they don't always. But on the other hand, when you look at recall of all the things that should match, how many does it find? Our model actually did much better than the Lebase model. And that probably makes sense. The Lebase model is actually trained to find parallel sentences across languages, things that were translations of one another, where, of course, we were focused on things that had the same meaning, even if they weren't translations. And so in a strange sort of fate, we've treaded this line where we have almost the same precision, but we were able to boost recall in comparison to that model. And F1 is sort of an overall score. It's just the harmonic mean of those two. And we're able to get a model that is performing very well, at least, for these languages in this particular setting. Ultimately, that model is available, open source. The data that we labeled to do the evaluation is also open. And earlier this year, we repeated that and developed a Filipino model for similarity of claims across languages in much the same way. And that's actually being used again by one of our students who's wrapping up their MSc thesis from last year. So those, of course, those methods can be very useful to practitioners to start grouping models in the sort of tip line case I was sharing. But those same models, of course, can help us answer good social science questions as well. Can we start to understand misinformation? What are some of the factors behind it? How we respond? And even, to what extent are tip lines capturing anything of abuse? That was a particular question that I was wondering about as an academic. It's like, okay, tip lines, they seem nice, but are they capturing useful content? And I had a great opportunity with Kiran Garamella, who had been scraping large WhatsApp groups in India in 2019 during the same time that first WhatsApp tip line I mentioned was running. And so Kiran had this large data set, 669,000 text messages, 1.3 million images from large WhatsApp groups where the join link was published online openly, and they were roughly in the political context. And we had data from this tip line that Proto, a nonprofit news organization, was running in WhatsApp. And so we thought, well, this is a great opportunity. Let's see how our data sets compare. And ultimately, it led to a publication that came out earlier this year in the Misinfo review. I should also say we were joined on this paper by Gautam from Duesenberg Isen, who's here in the audience. So thanks, Gautam, for joining us as well. We had a method for image similarity to find similar images. We had the method for text similarity that I was just speaking about. And we had ways to cluster that content together. So there's a lot more in the paper, but I'll just give you some high level feelings for this, right? We wanted to know, well, what are tip lines actually capturing, and will they be effective for fact checking? So we wanted to look at coverage, how much of the content is being captured. That tip line data set is really much smaller than what could be data mined on the open web. Timeliness, how fast do they cover it? And popularity, is there any difference between your sort of general content and the most popular content spreading on the platform? And so from that first one, sort of the coverage, we found that, look, if an image was shared 100 or more times, or more than 100 times on the public groups, it was very likely to be in the tip line data set as well, about 67% of the time, 2/3 of the time, we'd find a match in the tip line. For text messages, it drops off a little bit. It's about 23%. We can come back to that, but I think part of that challenge is there's so many more ways to express the same claim in text than maybe there is in an image. When you take an image and it's forwarded and reshared, it's maybe reshared in the same way more often, and text seems to change a bit more. So coverage is important, but we know timeliness is as well. Misinformation travels fast, and so the question we also had was, how quickly did something reach the tip lines? And so I'll walk you through this graph first, and then the other one will make more sense. Here we have the difference in days between a message appearing on the public groups and appearing in the tip line. Blue is all content, and this is a cumulative sum. So we see here, about half appears first on public groups, and about half appeared first on the tip lines when it came to all images. But if we zoomed in and looked only at the top 10%, the most popular images being shared in the public groups, we actually saw that the majority of them were being shared on the tip line first. I have to say that was a real shock to me. I did not expect to see that. I thought, it's a smaller group, it's more select. But it seems like maybe what we're seeing on WhatsApp is that there's a lot more person-to-person sharing. When you look at sharing on traditional social media, open social media like Twitter, where there's been lots of scholarship, when people say viral, they're not, most things on Twitter don't go viral. They get to a large node who has lots of followers, and that node broadcasts it to many people, right? There's a sort of big broadcast event. And so things on Twitter travel incredibly quick because they hit these big nodes, they get broadcast to a number of users. If we really talk about something going viral, person to person at a time, it seems like we're maybe seeing a little bit more of that on WhatsApp. That's just conjecture, because obviously I don't have data to see on WhatsApp. No one has data on WhatsApp. It's end-to-end encrypted, right? But it suggests that, and also what we've seen is there's a bit of a slower spread of that misinformation, or slower spread of information in general. And so perhaps the fact that group sizes are smaller, there's limits on forwarding, some of that has stretched out how long it takes content to move from one place to another. For text, it's actually a very similar story. It's sort of too much. I should have removed URLs from here, but the blue line is all text in the cumulative distribution here. And again, it's pretty split, but if you look at the top text items, again, they're more often actually appearing on the tip line prior to that, prior to occurring in these public groups. So yeah, it was quite a surprise to see that we were actually capturing a sort of meaningful proportion, I think, of content, and often capturing that content quite early. So what is this content, you might want to know? I'll say a little bit about that as well. These were three of the top images, or the three top images shared to the tip line. One was a false circular alleging, I forget now, government work on terrorist plot. That was what it was. Flags supposedly at a politician rally, some doctored screenshots. And actually, if you look across all of the images that were shared, these are sort of clustered, and then some random representative examples of different clusters being chosen. You'll see that there's a lot of pictures of text, newspapers or graphics, memes being shared around. Yeah, there's some groups of people, but lots more infographics. Overall, images of text made up 40% of the data, and memes made up another 40% of the images, and memes made up another 35% of the images. And so definitely there's a sort of, heavy emphasis on what's in the image as well. As far as text messages, well, there were about 89,000 text messages. We could cluster those down into where there were groups, 560 of those, 173 election related, 177 more about the tip line and people asking questions there. And quite nice for me to see as someone who is really interested in language, that, while English and Hindi dominated the content we were seeing, in some instances, we would see the same claim repeated into up to 6 different languages being grouped together. And so there's definitely this case that content is spreading across languages. Of course, that may be something particular to the setting of India in this case as well. What was there? Well, election misinformation about a tender vote, what you should do if you weren't on the election roll at polls. Something about 3 check marks on WhatsApp for those who are using WhatsApp, right? You send a message, it has 1 check mark, the recipient receives it, it has 2, there's recipient reads it, those check marks turn blue, and if the government reads it, it gets a that was the one that was going around, misinformation, not true. But that was the one going around. And actually, I've seen that recycled so many times since then. Predominant themes are things you'd probably expect around politicians and political parties, things of that nature. Although I'll also say people were really engaged with the fact that there was a fact-checking organization, Proto in this case, on the other end of the tip line. They were following up on content they'd written. They're saying, oh, do you have that resource in another language? And I don't think a tip line like this would have worked as just a research project. We had just said, hey, we're Oxford researchers. Will you send stuff to our tip line? I think a real motivation for people engaging in this tip line was because there was a practical ability to discover information and a team of people working to investigate some of these claims and follow up. I'll give just a short plug to say the Brazilian elections that happened in the last 2 months in September and in October. Also, there were 5 fact-checking organizations running tip lines in Brazil. And also the Brazilian Election Authority, the TSE, had a chatbot that was being powered by software Midan created to ultimately receive millions of views. And so we have a big WhatsApp data set there. One of our MSc students this year, Adriano, has collected videos from Kiwi, a sort of TikTok-like application that's very popular in Brazil, and simultaneously Midan had been collecting tweets from Twitter. And so I'm super excited to start thinking across platforms as well. What do these things look like? And across modalities, we have comments in videos, short form videos. To what extent are the claims similar or different in these different settings? And yeah, I think ultimately what I'm super excited about is, community tip lines are giving us this focused data where people are spotting things and forwarding it in to try to discover resources or bring it to the attention of community organizations. And thinking about how we mirror that up with maybe some of the larger scale data mining and also data donation that can be possible. And I'll show you an example of what I mean with that. Professor Kiran Garamella, who I've been collaborating with for a number of years now, I think is at the vanguard of doing some of the most exciting data donation work. One example of that is a Android app called What's Viral. It's still under development here, but you can install this on your phone on an Android device when you're using WhatsApp. It actually downloads any of the images that are received by WhatsApp to the phone, and they can be accessed by other applications. And so on an opt-in basis, with users choosing to do this, you can authorize this app to see those images. It produces a hash of the image. So not the image itself, but just a high-level representation that then shares those hashes. And we can start to see, oh, how many other people have also seen this same image that you have? And you can get a sort of report back and start to understand, hey, this image I'm seeing on WhatsApp, oh, how many other people saw it? And, compared to when I saw it versus others are seeing it, am I at the, in the leading edge? Am I a laggard, receiving it much later? What's that looking like? And I think this is exciting for, just understanding yourself, where things are coming from. but it also has huge opportunities for community organizations, fact-checking organizations to start understanding, the trajectory of misinformation, well, information in general, and maybe misinformation within that. So large-scale data mining. The other thing is returning back to text. There's so many different ways to express the same idea. And so one question is, how can we, so much of fact checking right now is focused one claim at a time. Each one of these claims is about COVID and masking. And, traditionally we'd address each claim separately, but that's a lot of work. And if we could group them together into larger categories, we might be able to sort of respond to a whole bunch of claims with sort of one explainer. And Professor Kathleen Jamieson at the Annenberg Public Policy Center, also co-founder of factcheck.org, I think has been doing amazing work on this. And so all of these claims over there, you might say, well, look, they can all be supported by this explainer, which is, what do we know about face masks and coronavirus, right? And you can keep that up to date with the latest science, and it actually addresses all of those claims. And Kathleen and her team have found that with communicable diseases and general respiratory diseases, you can probably break things down into 7, 12 categories and cover, the vast majority. And this might mean, if you can anticipate those, right, then you can start to actually preempt the misinformation. You can have something ready before anyone's ever asked about that particular claim. And so also from a machine learning perspective, of course, it's much easier to map things into categories as a classifier than it is to say, oh, is that claim true or false? Wow, that's a much harder point to make, right? And so just as a quick example, right, you could say, hey, it's, false claim. COVID is just like the flu, right? We can search fact checks for that, and we can find something that's pretty close with our technology. Okay, more lethal than the cold. That's kind of close. But you could also think about this in terms of searching those categories. And actually, it's not even search, it's categorization. And here it says, oh, the top category for this claim is the nature, existence, and virulence of COVID. Right? And that's absolutely the sort of bang on for this. And the opportunity here is that you have a claim you've never heard about before. I don't know, COVID is from Mars or something. As far as I know, there's no fact checks on that. No, nothing relevant there. But what's the category? Origins of COVID-19, right? And we can have a well-sourced article on that. And so I think it's a tremendously exciting opportunity to bring these things together. So community tip lines, data mining and donation, machine learning for preventative explainers, or preemptive explainers rather. And of course, to do that, you have to figure out what are the categories. And so I want to close here with two thoughts. One, we absolutely need the social sciences, right? We need to understand what are the themes and the categories that are going to recur in it, where it makes sense to put that effort into preemptive resources. So ethnography, communication design, discourse analysis, absolutely essential. And I think also this is bringing some great opportunities for data sharing and further academic inquiry. And so the last thing I'll end with is that I feel tremendously blessed to be here at the OII and have been supported to take on this additional externally funded role. But part of my time being, with Medan as a practitioner, more focused organization. And I think there's such great opportunities from trying to straddle that academic practitioner gap a bit. We can learn there are problems that practitioners face in practice that make really great research questions. And there are, otherwise, there are also things we do in academia that maybe we sort of miss the mark and they don't have a use, or they are really great, but the practitioners lack the skills or the knowledge to even know that solution exists, right? And so bringing community organizations, fact-checking organizations, and academics together, I think is a really powerful point. And so I'll close there with just, a big thanks to a huge number of collaborators. Anytime you start putting people on a slide, there's probably a danger I've left someone out. So apologies for anyone who's might be missing, but huge thank you to all the collaborators who've been part of this work, and huge thank you to you as well. And I'm looking forward to questions. So thank you.
Thank you.